Gabriel Fernandez, an 8-year-old boy, lived in Palmdale, California, with his mother, Pearl Fernandez, 29, a stay-at-home parent, and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre, 32, a security guard. Gabriel was a bright and loving child, adored by his grandparents, who had cared for him for most of his life. However, after being placed back in Pearl's custody, his life took a tragic turn. Pearl struggled with parenting and had a history of neglect, while Isauro was known for his aggressive demeanor. Together, they created a hostile environment for Gabriel, leading to unimaginable suffering that would ultimately shock the entire nation. Before we dive into this case, we'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support means a lot. Let's get started. Gabriel Fernandez was born on February 20, 2005, to Pearl Fernandez, a woman whose own childhood had been marked by neglect, trauma, and abuse. Pearl, at just 26 years old, was already a mother of 3 when Gabriel came into the world. Raised in a dysfunctional home, Pearl struggled with addiction and had a history of troubled relationships. Her youth was riddled with emotional scars, and it would become evident that these early experiences shaped how she would raise her own children. Pearl's relationship with her own mother was fraught with difficulty. She had grown up in a chaotic household where both physical and emotional abuse were rampant. Her mother struggled with substance abuse, and Pearl was often left to fend for herself. This lack of care and support during her formative years planted the seeds of her own inability to care for her children. Pearl's experience was not unique. Many who grow up in such abusive environments struggle to break the cycle. But for Pearl, the damage was done. By the time Gabriel was born, she was already battling her own demons, trying to juggle the demands of motherhood with an overwhelming sense of abandonment and anger from her own childhood. As Gabriel grew, his life would be impacted by the lack of stability that Pearl's past had created. His early years were marked by an absence of nurturing care and the constant presence of unpredictable turmoil. But despite this, Gabriel's gentle nature stood out. Teachers, family members, and those around him noted how quiet and shy he was, but they also noticed that he was a sweet and affectionate child when he did feel safe enough to show it. Pearl had 3 children, but Gabriel was the most vulnerable. His older siblings were distant, and the family dynamics were fractured. Gabriel's early years were marked by neglect, and it was evident that his mother's struggle with emotional instability and addiction prevented her from providing the care and security he needed. Pearl's first relationship with the father of her children was fraught with violence and abuse. After that, her romantic relationships remained toxic. Gabriel's biological father was largely absent from his life, leaving Pearl to navigate the hardships of parenting on her own. She would eventually meet Isauro Aguirre, a man whose troubled past would intertwine with her own, ultimately setting the stage for the horrors to come. Isauro Aguirre entered Pearl's life in 2009. He was in his early 30s and had a history of aggression, violence, and emotional instability. He had a criminal background, including time spent in prison. Despite these red flags, Pearl saw something in him and allowed him to move into her home with her children. At first, Isauro seemed like a savior to Pearl, someone who could provide stability and security. But this was far from the reality. His violent tendencies soon began to surface, and his relationship with Gabriel, in particular, would turn into one marked by extreme cruelty. Pearl's inability to see the danger in her relationship with Isauro would lead to a tragic and irreversible outcome. As their relationship grew, so did the tension and instability in their home. Gabriel, a sweet and innocent child, would become a target in this toxic environment. Despite some moments of apparent tenderness, Gabriel's life was steeped in neglect. He would soon face unimaginable abuse, a cycle of torment that would stretch for months. But it was not just the violence he endured from Isauro that led to his suffering. It was Pearl's complicity in it. Pearl failed to protect her son, choosing to turn a blind eye to the horrors he was facing under the roof she controlled. By the time Gabriel was 8 years old, he had already endured a lifetime of neglect, abuse, and heartache. His cries for help went unheard. Teachers and social workers who suspected something was wrong were ignored. The system that should have protected him failed, and Gabriel's suffering would only intensify. In 2009, Pearl Fernandez's life took another turn when she met Isauro Aguirre. At the time, Isauro was a man in his early 30s, and like Pearl, he carried his own heavy baggage. With a criminal history, including time spent in prison, he was no stranger to violence. He had struggled with anger issues throughout his life, and his past was filled with episodes of abuse, manipulation, and toxic relationships. Despite these warning signs, Pearl found something in Isauro that she believed could help her. She was looking for stability, something to fill the void left by years of emotional trauma and failed relationships. To her, Isauro seemed like a solution to her problems. But this connection, built on the illusion of security, would soon become the catalyst for an even darker tragedy. Isauro moved into Pearl's home in late 2009, bringing with him his own set of emotional baggage. The couple quickly became inseparable, and Isauro's presence in the household introduced a new dynamic, one that would unravel Gabriel's life in unimaginable ways. Though he seemed charismatic and charming at first, Isauro's darker side began to surface. Pearl's children, including Gabriel, quickly began to see a different side of him, one filled with rage, cruelty, and threats. Isauro's behavior grew increasingly erratic, and it soon became clear that he was not the protector Pearl had hoped for. Instead, he was an abuser, someone who would soon target the most vulnerable member of the household, 8-year-old Gabriel. As Isauro's influence over Pearl deepened, the atmosphere in the home began to shift. Gabriel, once a sweet, gentle child, became the target of Isauro's twisted control. The abuse escalated from verbal insults to physical violence. Gabriel was a small, quiet boy, easily controlled by fear. But it wasn't just Isauro who was complicit. Pearl, his mother, turned a blind eye to the mounting signs of abuse. She became an enabler, allowing Isauro to dominate her children's lives, particularly Gabriel's. Isauro's abusive behavior was not just physical. He took pleasure in humiliating Gabriel, breaking him down emotionally, and punishing him for the smallest of infractions. Gabriel's screams, once ignored by his mother, became a regular soundtrack in the house, a haunting reminder of the child's ongoing suffering. Pearl, who should have been the one to protect him, became an accomplice in his torment. In fact, Pearl's attachment to Isauro blinded her to the reality of what was happening under her own roof. Instead of protecting her child, she chose to support Isauro, excusing his cruelty with misguided loyalty. Gabriel, meanwhile, found himself trapped in a toxic and dangerous environment. He had no escape, no one to turn to, and no voice that could be heard. The more Isauro was allowed to stay, the worse things became for Gabriel. The abuse, which had started subtly, grew worse with time. Gabriel was physically beaten, starved, and isolated from the outside world. His world was now confined to the walls of a house where love had been replaced with cruelty, and every corner held the threat of punishment. It was during this time that the cycle of abuse would deepen, leading Gabriel to a point where survival was all he could focus on. While Isauro and Pearl's relationship seemed to outsiders like any other partnership, it was anything but normal. Behind closed doors, the violence was escalating, and Gabriel was caught in the middle. As we move into the next phase of this story, the true nature of their twisted relationship will reveal itself. A relationship built on manipulation, cruelty, and a deadly lack of empathy that would eventually lead to Gabriel's tragic end. As Isauro Aguirre entered the home, his presence initially seemed to promise a fresh start for Pearl and her children. But it quickly became apparent that his demeanor was far from what Pearl had hoped for. His charming facade quickly gave way to a darker, more volatile side. The first signs of abuse were subtle but disturbing. Gabriel, a quiet, sensitive boy, found himself the target of Isauro's growing temper. The smallest mistakes, being too loud, spilling food, or not finishing chores, became triggers for anger. What started as harsh words soon escalated into physical punishment. Gabriel, though just a child, was already showing signs of fear. His once bright demeanor began to fade. He grew more withdrawn, avoiding eye contact, speaking less, and trying to blend into the background as much as possible. But no matter how hard he tried, Isauro's wrath was always lurking just behind him. A slap on the back of the head here, a cruel shout there. These were the small cracks that hinted at the terror unfolding in that home. At school, Gabriel's teachers began to notice the changes in him. The child who once loved to participate was now silent, his eyes constantly downcast. His clothes were worn, and his face had the telltale marks of neglect. Teachers saw bruises, but when they asked, Gabriel would offer no explanation. It wasn't that he didn't want to speak, it was that he was too terrified to do so. Fear, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of isolation had already taken hold of him. Meanwhile, Pearl, who had once been a nurturing figure, became numb to the growing signs of abuse. Instead of protecting her child, she began to side with Isauro. He told her that Gabriel was difficult, that he needed strict discipline. Pearl, who had fallen deeper into her attachment to Isauro, believed him. The idea that her child might be in danger seemed foreign to her. She excused his actions and even justified his behavior, viewing it as a form of tough love. Gabriel's fear intensified. Every day felt like a battle for survival in his own home. The small, everyday moments were now filled with tension and dread. Gabriel had learned to stay out of Isauro's way, always walking on eggshells, afraid that any wrong move might provoke another outburst. The once warm and loving family dynamic had shifted into something unrecognizable, a home where fear was the dominant emotion. As the abuse became more consistent, Gabriel's physical condition deteriorated. He was forced to endure long periods of isolation, severe punishment, and neglect. He was given less food, fewer comforts, and less emotional support. His childhood, which should have been filled with love, play, and joy, had instead become an endless cycle of pain and fear. But even in the face of such cruelty, Gabriel remained quiet, too frightened to speak up, too afraid to ask for help. He believed, as many abused children do, that it was his fault, that somehow he deserved the torment. By now, Gabriel had retreated into a shell, a young child burdened by far too much for his tender years. The signs of abuse were becoming more visible, but those who might have intervened were either blind to them or too afraid to act. His world was shrinking, and it seemed as though no one would be able to break him free from the web of fear and manipulation he was caught in. Isauro's cruelty continued to escalate. Gabriel's suffering, though not yet fully visible to the outside world, was becoming unbearable. In the coming days, the torment would reach new heights, leading to a tragedy that would shock the nation. The first signs of abuse, which began with harsh words and small punishments, would soon evolve into something much darker, leading to an unimaginable end. But for now, the world saw only a quiet, withdrawn boy, no one knowing just how much pain he was truly enduring. As Gabriel's life spiraled, the abuse became more brutal. He was forced to eat cat litter, severely beaten, and locked in a small cabinet as punishment. Isauro would often taunt and verbally abuse him, calling him worthless, while Pearl, his mother, stood by and allowed the abuse to continue. Days turned into months of torture. Gabriel was starved, his face bruised, his body burned by cigarettes, his body covered in open wounds. His condition worsened daily. The morning of May 22, 2013, began like any other for Gabriel Fernandez. But for him, it would be his last. The violence that had been building for months, even years, would finally come to a head. His home, once a place of warmth and love, had long since turned into a prison of fear. Gabriel had no way of knowing that this day would mark the tragic and brutal end of his short life. The events that unfolded that fateful day began with a seemingly simple argument. Pearl and Isauro, as they often did, began to fight. The cause of the argument was trivial, like many of the others that had triggered Gabriel's abuse. But this time, Isauro's fury reached a boiling point. It wasn't just words anymore. It was anger that had been festering, and now it erupted in violence. Gabriel, as always, tried to stay out of the way. He knew from experience that avoiding Isauro when he was enraged was the only way to survive. But that day, the cruelty that had been lurking in the shadows of their home for so long would be unleashed in full force. Gabriel would become the target of Isauro's wrath once again. What happened next was unimaginable. Isauro, already violent and filled with rage, attacked Gabriel. He beat the child mercilessly, striking him repeatedly with fists and a wooden board. Gabriel, already fragile from months of abuse, was no match for the man who towered over him. In the moments that followed, the beating turned into something more savage, an attack meant to punish and break a child. Gabriel's body, already weakened from hunger, bruises, and the years of mistreatment, could not withstand the brutality that was being inflicted upon him. His small frame, broken and battered, could barely move. His cries for help were drowned out by Isauro's violent rage. Pearl, too paralyzed by fear and her own manipulation by Isauro, did nothing to stop it. She watched, helplessly, as her son was beaten to the brink of death. At some point, Gabriel was left unconscious, lying in a pool of his own blood. His body had suffered injuries beyond comprehension, broken ribs, severe internal bleeding, and blunt force trauma. Yet, the abuse did not end there. Isauro and Pearl, rather than seek help, continued their efforts to cover up the truth. Gabriel was left lying, cold and unresponsive, for hours. Hours passed, and Gabriel's condition deteriorated. But Isauro and Pearl, in their twisted mindset, refused to take him to the hospital. In their minds, seeking help would expose their crime, and they were determined to conceal what had happened. They continued to live in a delusion, believing they could get away with what they had done. Later that evening, when Gabriel's condition was beyond saving, Pearl finally contacted emergency services, but by then it was too late. The child who had been beaten and tortured for months was beyond any medical intervention. When paramedics arrived, Gabriel was already gone, his body a testament to the horror he had endured in his final hours. The police arrived soon after, and what they discovered inside the apartment was chilling. Gabriel's lifeless body, his young face bruised and battered beyond recognition, painted a picture of the unimaginable violence he had suffered. The officers were faced with the grim reality that this was not just the tragic death of a child. It was the result of sustained torture and abuse at the hands of those who were supposed to protect him. Isauro Aguirre and Gabriel Fernandez were arrested shortly after Gabriel's death. They were charged with murder and abuse, but the investigation would soon reveal the extent of the abuse Gabriel had endured. It was clear that the violence on that fateful day had not been an isolated incident, but the culmination of months, even years, of torment. What should have been a day of safety and security for a child instead became the final, tragic chapter of Gabriel's short life. On that day, Gabriel Fernandez, a young boy who had only known pain and fear in his final months, was no longer able to fight for his life. He died, a victim of the brutality that had haunted him for so long. His death would later serve as a tragic reminder of the consequences of abuse that went unnoticed, ignored, and unreported by those who should have been the first to protect him. In the aftermath of Gabriel's death, the world would come to learn of the horrors that had unfolded within the walls of that apartment. But for Gabriel, it was too late. His story became a heart-wrenching call for change, a plea for society to pay attention to the signs of abuse, and a reminder that every child deserves to live free from fear. Following the tragic death of Gabriel Fernandez, the investigation into his death began immediately, though it would quickly reveal disturbing failures and a series of events that would ultimately lead to arrests. What should have been a straightforward case of child abuse turned into a complex investigation, as authorities struggled to piece together the truth. Paramedics had tried in vain to save Gabriel's life, but by the time he was pronounced dead, it was clear to investigators that something was terribly wrong. The child's body showed signs of severe abuse: bruising, burns, fractures, and it was immediately apparent that Gabriel's death was no accident. The authorities launched a full investigation, and what they uncovered in the following days would shock the world. Pearl Fernandez and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre, were the immediate suspects in Gabriel's death. Both had been living with Gabriel in the apartment, and both had failed to provide any meaningful care or protection. Though the couple had initially tried to cover up the truth, claiming that Gabriel's death was from natural causes, investigators quickly began to see through their lies. Pearl Fernandez, who was the biological mother of Gabriel, initially claimed that her son had collapsed and that she had no idea what caused his death. However, investigators soon discovered that her story didn't add up. Pearl's initial statements were inconsistent with the evidence at the scene and Gabriel's injuries. Gabriel's body showed clear signs of prolonged abuse, multiple fractures, burns, and signs of malnutrition. His injuries were consistent with being struck with various objects and being severely neglected for an extended period of time. This was no sudden accident. Gabriel had suffered for months under the hands of those who were supposed to love and care for him. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Gabriel's case had been mishandled for months. Social workers had failed to intervene despite multiple warnings and reports of abuse. Teachers and neighbors had reported Gabriel's distress, but nothing had been done to remove him from the dangerous environment he was living in. Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were not forthcoming with information. But soon, Pearl's own admissions began to unravel their facade. During a series of interrogations, she claimed that she had been under stress and that she had trusted Isauro to discipline Gabriel. It became clear that both she and Isauro had been complicit in the abuse. Isauro Aguirre, the boyfriend, was the most direct culprit in the abuse. He had been the one to carry out much of the physical punishment. During the investigation, it was revealed that Aguirre was not only physically abusive but had also psychologically tortured Gabriel, calling him derogatory names and forcing him to undergo severe physical punishment for minor infractions. Aguirre's level of cruelty towards Gabriel was chilling, and it became apparent that his actions were fueled by anger and rages. During his interview with detectives, Isauro Aguirre eventually admitted to some of the abuse, but he minimized his role in Gabriel's death. He claimed that the abuse was necessary for Gabriel to learn discipline, offering a disturbing justification for his violent actions. Despite his attempt to downplay his responsibility, Aguirre's statements only further revealed the depth of his cruelty. Both Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were arrested in connection with Gabriel's death. On charges of torture and first-degree murder, they were booked into the Los Angeles County Jail, where they awaited trial. The community was shaken, and the public outrage grew as more details of Gabriel's abuse came to light. A system had failed him, and now justice was beginning to move forward. The charges against Pearl and Isauro were severe, and they would have to answer for the brutal murder of Gabriel Fernandez. As the case proceeded, public attention turned to the trial, where the details of Gabriel's final months were laid bare for all to see. The abuse, the neglect, and the unimaginable cruelty Gabriel suffered were put on display for the world to witness, as investigators and legal teams worked to build a case that would hold both his mother and her boyfriend accountable. The investigation and subsequent arrests of Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were only the beginning of the long process of justice for Gabriel. His death sparked an outcry that led to calls for reform in child protection systems and more accountability for those in positions of care. It was clear that Gabriel's suffering had not been in vain. His story was going to lead to change. As the case progressed, the public, the media, and child advocacy groups remained focused on ensuring that Gabriel's death would not be forgotten, and that his killers would be brought to justice. The investigation had begun the painful journey toward accountability, but the real work of healing and making changes in child protection policies was just beginning. The trial that followed was a painful journey through the depths of human depravity. Aguirre's defense tried to claim he wasn't solely responsible, yet the evidence was irrefutable. Gabriel's life had been taken by the very people who were supposed to love and protect him. In 2018, Aguirre was sentenced to death, and Pearl Fernandez was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Gabriel's death sparked a wave of outrage and calls for justice. The case brought attention to the failures of the child welfare system and raised questions about how such abuse could go unnoticed for so long. In the wake of his death, activists, lawmakers, and concerned citizens pushed for reforms, striving to ensure that no other child suffers as Gabriel did. Gabriel Fernandez's story serves as a painful reminder that some children are not protected, and their suffering can go unnoticed by the very systems meant to shield them. His case will never be forgotten, and his legacy is one of those that drives change. Rest in peace, Gabriel. May your story inspire a world that does better by its children. What are your thoughts on this true crime case? Share your opinions in the comments below.